Well, here we are down in the basement at Redgate Farm, which doubles as a larder. We have food and we have coats. The forced pork has gone off to freezer camp, and now they're safely tucked away here in the chest freezer, and we have to deal with their fat, rendering it into lard. Some people ask us, if we took our pigs to the butcher, then why do we render our own fat? Well, in the early days, we would butcher all of our own pigs, and we would go ahead and render their fat ourselves. Once we started going to a butcher, that butcher would separate out the fat from our pigs and render it, and so we just had them do it when they processed. However, some processors won't do that. They simply throw all the lard from all the hogs that are in their facility into one big vat. We do not want our fat mixed with other fat because of the way we feed our pigs and the way we treat our pigs. Our fat's decidedly different than most fat based on the feeds. And so this year we're actually doing our own fat, and this is good for people also who don't have hogs. But you can go to a person who raises their hogs and say, hey, if you don't use your fat, I'll take it and render it. So let's get started on what we do here. First of all, we're in the larder because it's nice and cool down here. I've got a thermometer. It says it's 45 degrees. I like that because this fat, once it gets warm, it's very difficult to handle. It gets very sticky and very slippery. Another thing is you want that fat frozen, but not too frozen hard. And so one of the things I do is I actually take it out of the freezer and put it in one of these big igloo coolers overnight or for a couple days. It allows it to heat up just a little bit, but not too much. It's still got a good strong consistency here, so it's very cuttable, okay? So that's a technique you should use to let this fat warm up a little bit, but not too much, so that you can cut it up really well. Now, as we look here at the different jars here, people are wondering, when you render your lard, what should it look like? Well, one of these jars is milk, okay? It was just, the goats were milked this morning. The other two jars are lard. This is leaf lard, this is back fat lard, and this is actually our milk jar right here. So as you can see, it ought to be about the same color as a freshly milked goat or a freshly milked cow. So you're looking for this white. Leaf lard, we'll talk about that in a second. This is back fat and belly lard. And of course, this is my goat milk, so you don't need to worry about that right now. So some of the things we get out, nice sharp knives, because you're going to want to shave off some of the meat from the lard, and a sharpening steel. And I use a meat grinder here, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But the meat grinder, if you grind it into small bits like that, it actually significantly speeds up the process of rendering the lard. If you don't have a grinder, that's fine. You can still do it. You just need to cut it up into little bitty pieces. And the other thing about grinding is you kind of lose the cracklings, the big chunky cracklings, but you can still make cracklings, and we'll get into that later. Okay, so let's talk about the different types of fat that you're going to get off your pig. So let's start down here. This is like what they cut off the tip of a roast, okay? So the roast has a whole bunch of fat on it. They're cutting the roast out, and they'll cut this off. And you see there's a big chunk of meat in there. You want to get that out of there, because what happens is, although that cooks up real nice as a big chunk of fried pork in there, it can cause the fat to be discolored, and it can cause it to be flavored. And you want fat that's not flavored, okay? So this is back fat. It's real easy to see. They peeled off the skin. If you can see on the camera, I'm not sure if you can, but there's little dimples in here, okay? That's where they peeled the skin off, and this is the fat right under the back. And you can see here there's even a stamp there, and I'll actually cut that out too, because that dye will actually discolor your fat also. We don't need that dye in there. But if you flip over here, you see as they cut it off the back, again, they take chunks of meat with it, and you want to cut those out. And I'll actually cut those out and save those and fry those up separate, and I use those in soups and stuff. But this is going to keep your lard really clean if you can get that stuff out of there. Now this is belly fat, okay, and this is where the bacon comes from. And as they're cutting the bacon, they get down to pieces where they can't cut more bacon. But this is still, you know, these are still bacon strips, so I'll go ahead and cut those out of there. And again, I use those for soups and stews and things like that. Then lastly, we have what's called the leaf lard. Now this comes out of the inside of the pig. This lard is wrapped around the kidneys. You can see how different it is from the rest of the lard. It's not a big sheet of fat. It's real bumpy. It's irregularly shaped like a big amoeba. And if you've ever butchered an animal, you reach in around those kidneys and you pull that fat off. This is exactly where this comes from. And you'll see little things like this. See this, this thin layer here? You'll see pieces in there like that. And that will actually cook up into cracklings too. So these are our different lards, and our butcher was kind enough, even though he wouldn't render our lard separately from others, he was kind enough to separate out the leaf lard from the rest of it. So I was very happy that he did that. We're going to keep it separate, and we're going to put these in separate jars because the leaf lard tends to have less flavor, and it's best for pies and pastries and things like that where you don't want that bacon flavor. Now, if you do a really good job with this, you're not going to get much bacon flavor either, but it definitely is less pure than the leaf lard, so you want to save this for your bacon. What I'm doing right now is I'm cutting the pieces of fat into about 1-inch cubes, not real exact, but I want them to go into the grinder down the chute, and so if I can put them into 1-inch cubes is a little bit better. And I'm separating out the meat, but I don't throw that meat away. All right. I actually shave it off like so. Now this cut glove is nice because this fat gets real slippery, and these things grip the fat really well. It doesn't get slippery as the fat warms up, which is kind of critical. But you see that nice piece of meat there? I throw it in a pile. We'll cook that up later, and you'll have chunks of pork flavor for your soups. Yeah, here we've got a little bit of that dye that was on there. I'm going to get rid of that, and I've got a waste bucket on the side here. I don't want the dye. I don't want big blood clots. There's still a little bit of meat there, and I'm pretty particular about getting all that meat out of there because I've got plenty of fat. This is just pure fat here. And as I cut it into these small chunks, I can check to see if there's any interstitial meat. In other words, meat in the middle of it. And this looks relatively clean, so I'm not worried about that. And we just go on and on. This is a nice clean piece. There's very little meat there. Once I get that out of there, I could probably just chop up the whole piece into these 1-inch strips. And then Ruth, my lovely assistant, will put it all through the grinder, and she also watches for impurities as she's throwing it through the grinder. The cleaner, the better. Go ahead, Ruth. I really like this is an old style rival 20-quart roaster oven. A lot of the newer versions have automatic settings on them that will actually shut it down and start it up and shut it down and start it up. This is all manually controlled. You put in the temperature and that will go to that temperature, and it doesn't have these shut-off features that, you know, might be safe, but it really takes away your control of the lard, and you really need to have a lot of control. I don't like to be real hot on this. And the first thing I'm going to do is get it up here around 200 and start. I want to get a little bit of a fat grease layer in the bottom before I actually turn it up. because what I don't want to do is I don't want to burn this at all. So let's go around and get this in here. So this comes straight from the basement, right out of the meat grinder, and it goes in there. It kind of sticks in there. It heats up quickly. You saw downstairs it was nice and firm. Now it's getting real sloppy and sticky. And that's why you don't want it much above freezing, if above freezing at all when you're down there cooking. Now what's going to happen over the next couple minutes is you're going to get a little layer of fat in the bottom, and we're going to keep moving this around because I don't want to burn any of it. I want to heat it up really, really slowly. Our purpose here is to boil out the impurities, and there's a lot of water in fat, and you want to boil that out. Now some people, in order not to scald their fat, they'll throw water in the bottom of their pan first, and you can do that, but realize that in the end you want all that water boiled out. So instead of doing that, this only took about 5 minutes. If you just very slowly heat it up, you can do the same thing you would do if you put water in there, but you don't then have to boil the rest of that water out, because you don't want water in your fat because it will spoil and it'll mold over time if your lard has water in it. So this electric pot makes it a little bit easier than the one on the stove, although I do have a big pot on the stove, and I'll be doing the same thing there, but I'll just be a little slow with that one too, because that's a gas stove and you can scald your fat pretty quickly.
We've got the assembly line going here to make our lard. Sean already showed you how he started it in the roaster oven. Now I'm starting a batch here on the stove. The only reason we're doing both methods is because the roaster oven does not have enough space in it for all the lard we're going to be processing today. So obviously you can use either method, stovetop, roaster oven, and crock pot. There's a million ways to do this. One note about using the stove here though is you're going to have a lot more focused heat. So we actually have been working this about 20 minutes now to make sure it doesn't burn. Anytime you have focused heat like a propane stove or an electric stove, wherever that fat makes contact, you risk burning. And that would taint the flavor of your entire batch. So we've been working this a while to make sure it heats evenly and lightly, slowly. All right, Sean has done a good bit of cutting out of the meat scraps here off of the fat. So we're gonna hang on to these so that I can use them for cooking in the kitchen. But just to help me out when I cook, I like to give a quick weight so I can package most of them evenly. And for our family, I usually use about 1 pound at a time in most of our stews and such. So there's 1 pound. It just makes it a little easier to portion things out ahead of time. That way you don't have to thaw too much to get what you want. And we'll just kind of do a quick wrap here. This is a freezer butcher paper, so it's wax lined. Obviously, I'm not going for perfect aesthetics, more air tightness so it doesn't freeze or burn before we use it. We usually use this stuff up pretty quickly. And we'll label it. And now the family can use the real bacon for breakfast, and we can use the scraps for the cooking. So everybody's happy.
We're back in the kitchen now, and it's about 65 degrees, if it's 45 degrees, so it's kind of nice up here. And down here, we've got 2 pots of this going. If you look carefully, there's little bubbles coming up, and you could see the cracklings in there. And as you move it around, you'll see some more bubbles come up. That's the impurities coming out and the water coming out of these cracklings. And we do that relatively slowly. You see some of these are slightly browned, and that's okay. We keep the roaster oven temperature around 220 to 230 degrees Fahrenheit. You know, some people do hotter and other people do much cooler, but I like that because at 212 your water boils out. So you can see that there's really no more water boiling out except for maybe on the edges, and if I stir these a little bit, you might get some bubbles coming up from the bottom. So this is just about ready to go. Ready for us to strain this now and get that nice golden mixture of fat. So let's go look at the other pot over there. So here's the second pot, a little bit bigger. This has probably got about a good 50 pounds of fat. As you can see, the cracklings here, see there's a lot more bubbles coming up over here, and there's a lot more cracklings near the top. Some people say that once the cracklings fall to the bottom, you're done. I kind of found that to be pretty accurate. When there's a lot of them on the top, it's not quite done. They haven't boiled out all the moisture yet. But when they fall to the bottom, you noticed in the other pot, there were a lot more on the bottom. So this has got a lot more on the top. We were putting lard in here last. So we'll give this just a little bit more time than the other one. But this is a nice slow boil, and you got to watch that bottom so it doesn't get crusty on the bottom, because you can get some burning and scalding on the bottom, and that'll discolor, and it could give you an off flavor in the fat.
All right, we're back here only about 10 minutes since the last clip, and you can see all those pieces of floating material have sunk to the bottom. The oil has actually started to boil, and you can see some of these parts have taken on a golden color. So that means it is time to turn this off and move on to the next step. We're back here with everything set up and ready to strain out the material that's not the lard. So what I've got is the pot, of course, that we've been boiling. We have a double strainer, and if you've ever watched our syrup videos, you've seen this before, but the upper strainer is a little bigger holes than the lower strainer, so it just keeps the lower one basically from getting clogged up as fast. We can do a lot more without constant cleaning. And this is the pot for the cracklings to go in. So we're just gonna dip because I am suffering from some tendonitis and can't lift these big pots right now. And Sean had to leave for carriage rides. You can see right now, they're still pretty white and full of oil. They've still got some boiling down to do in their next pot. But this at least gets the material out of the oil that we want to keep pure, so it doesn't take on any flavors. All right, we'll take a break and empty that out. It doesn't have to be completely strained because it's actually going to simmer in this pot, so it needs oil anyway. You can see this upper strainer actually keeps the bottom one fairly clean. You'll notice I didn't even separate it out to dump that, but it keeps those little particles out of my oil. So you can see all that material that sank to the bottom. It's almost half of this pot. And that's what we have to get out of here. We'll finish this up and come back and show you what we've got. So I finished straining out all the bits from the one pot. And as you can see here, despite how methodical Sean was on cutting out those little pieces of visible meat, this is what remained in that fat. So it's a tremendous amount of little tiny bits of pork and little pieces of tissue. We even found a tiny little bone shard in there. So we're just going to put those in the pots. It's going to continue to simmer oil out of them. We will talk about what we do with that oil later, but this will prevent our actual lard from becoming tainted with any off colors or flavors. So here is where we're starting to get down to the main lard oil. You can see how it's just a beautiful kind of creamy color, but it's very clear, it's very clean. And right now what I'm doing is heating that up one last time. I'm going to check the temperature. We're looking at a temperature between 220 and 230 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is really the last step before we put it away for storage. We'll check back in a little bit. All right, I've reached 225 degrees Fahrenheit on the thermometer, so we are going to call it good. If I go any longer, despite the bubbles still coming up, then we risk burning it and making an off color to the lard. So we're going to stop it at the temperature. we'll move on to the next step. Okay, we're back here to finish rendering the lard. We have the hot oil that has already been, it's had all the cracklings filtered out of it once. And we've got a clean bucket that we're going to pour it into. This will be actually how we store. And then it's set up with a gamma seal ring here. So the lid will go on, it'll screw down real tight and seal it up. So the next thing we have here is, go ahead and set it down. We've got another strainer basket with a flour cloth over it. And this is going to be our final filtration. We only use the strainer just to hold it onto the bucket, but then the cloth is the main part so that it pulls out any extra little bits and pieces and floaties, anything that we might have missed in the main strainer. For anybody wondering, we've actually allowed this oil to sit and cool to about 160 degrees. Slow down. So that it doesn't melt the plastic bucket. This is a food grade plastic bucket designed for food storage. And I'm not exactly sure if we're going to fit it all in there, but we're going to try. Careful, may not go all the way. Wow, it did. I didn't think we'd get it. Yep. All right, so we've got it all straining through there. You can see it's just a nice golden color, and when this solidifies, it should be nice and white. And you can see there's just a few little, who knows, random pieces. Who knows where they came from. They get through the first strainer, so that's why we like to do this final straining through the cloth. Okay. So there you go. That is the batch that was in the pot. Now we get to go back to the roaster oven and do it again. All right, we're back to work with the cracklings here, mainly because I need to free up some pots. So as you can see, both of these pots boiled down to look like this black pot here. You can see how much oil came out of the cracklings and how they shrunk down and they browned. And over here, we've already poured some out, some of the oil. So you can see it's just a very brown, almost looks like bacon bits. What we're going to do is continue pouring it through a strainer, and you can see the oil that comes out of this mixture here. The oil is a lot darker golden than what we wind up using for lard. So we're still going to use this for lard, but as you can see, because of the darkness, it's going to have a richer flavor. And for that reason, that's going to go into a separate jar. Here in our family, we have a tradition called pig fat popcorn. That's just popcorn that we cook up on the stove, but we cook it in the pig fat. So we use this particular fat for that snack because it puts a little bit of a porky flavor. Who doesn't like that, right? But our kids love it. So that's how we use it. And then I'm going to take these cracklings. I've just got another flour cloth here sitting in a bowl. I'm going to dump them in, and after that's full, we will hang that in just a moment. So let's dump a few more. Nathan, can you hold that here? We're done straining out that first batch of cracklings. So as you can see, we've got this nice dark orange oil here. Little bit of residue in the bottom. I really don't worry too much about that because we use it for popcorn. It's a lot less formal. Then we've got all the cracklings sitting here in the cloth, still kind of straining. We're gonna let those strain for a few hours actually, and try to get them as dry as we can. But I just kind of knot these up. We have a particular cabinet we use to strain things like this and cheese and whatnot. And we just kind of hang it there, and you can see that oil will continue to run for several hours. And we can come every now and then, give it a little massage as it cools, and it will just continue pouring out. The drier we get it, the more crispy it will be. So Now we get to start that roaster oven batch and do all of this again.
Here we are back in the kitchen, and this is day 2. Overnight, everything cooled and turned into that milk white lard that we talked about at the very beginning of the video. We have 56 pounds of lard. We have about 5.5 pounds of cracklings, and these cracklings are not the big chunky cracklings that most people are used to. It's a small granular type of crackling, and we use those on salads, toppings for salads, toppings for casseroles, and things like meatloaf. Put them in 1-pound packages and use them in a lot of different recipes. We've got about 5.5, 6 pounds of, this is the popcorn lard that came from the cracklings. And we use that in the popcorn. It really brings a pork flavor to the popcorn. The kids absolutely love it. 9.5 pounds of meat scraps. Those are used for soups and stews. And finally, this is what we scraped out of the pots and pans. And you throw some bird seed in there, and the birds absolutely love it, especially in the wintertime. And chickens love it if you have animals like chickens. But we never want anything to go to waste. And as we see here, at the butcher, a lot of this stuff, and people don't want the fat, they just throw it away. And it's really a shame for this to be thrown away. If you look at our forced pork video in the Farm Tour series, you'll see that the way we raise our pork and the way we feed our pork and the way they forage through the woods, the omega-3 content is in sometimes orders of magnitude higher than normal pork that's raised in a confined animal feeding operation. So this is very high omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, so it can be very healthy for you. But we still got about 20 pounds of leaf lard to do, but it's the same process. So once we get that leaf lard done, we will be ready for winter time, all packed up in the larder. And this keeps really well in a root cellar or down in a basement or any place cool and dry. So that's it for this endeavor. We hope to see you again. Thanks for watching. If you'd like, leave us a comment. Give us suggestions for future videos. Subscribe to the channel and tell your friends to join us too. We love doing things here, teaching and learning a different way.